Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into a kind of loss that, well, it almost defies definition. It's like this persistent shadow that hangs over millions of lives.
It really does.
I mean, when most of us think about grief, we picture something finite. A heartbreaking certainty, sure, but an ending that lets you process and eventually try to move forward.
Exactly. Conventional grief, as devastating as it is, it follows certain, let's call them societal rituals. There's a timeline, acknowledgments, and even though the pain is there, the fact of the loss is solid. It's cemented.
But what happens to a person, to a family, when that certainty is just perpetually denied? What happens when the loss is just an open question day after day?
Well, that's where things get incredibly complicated for the human psyche.
And that really brings us to the hook for today's deep dive.
Yeah.
Ambiguous grief. This isn't just some clinical term you'd find in a textbook. It's a really precise way to describe the profound chronic pain that families of missing people all over the world are suffering.
It's the tension of holding two opposite realities in your mind at the same time.
And this essential concept, it was coined by Dr. Pauline Boss, a family therapist and researcher.
That's right. She was the one who really defined an ambiguous grief as mourning that happens because of a lack of closure. The thing that fuels the grief is the persistent, devastating unknown about a loved one's fate. The grief just can't end because their status is never confirmed.
And the source material we've gathered for this, wow. It lets us look at this massive problem from, I think, three really crucial angles. We're blending that deep psychological research on this kind of loss with some extremely granular, very technical studies.
Studies that analyze the data practices for missing children across different European Union member states.
Yeah.
And they're all over the map.
All over the map is an understatement. And then we have to look at the outside factors, right?
Absolutely. You can't ignore the social context.
So we're going to wrap up this deep dive with a critical look at media coverage bias, how it amplifies some stories and, more often, just completely silences others. We'll see how society itself decides which kind of ambiguous loss is treated with any urgency.
So our mission today is pretty ambitious.
It is. We need to fully unpack that unique, exhausting emotional struggle that families trapped in this limbo go through. And at the same time, we need to scrutinize the complex, often fragmented international systems that are supposed to find them.
Systems of police, hotlines, NGOs, all theoretically built to bring resolution. But as the research shows, they often struggle with the very basics, like just defining and counting the people they're trying to find.
Okay, let's start by unpacking this emotional state, because our sources are very clear that this kind of profound, persistent loss, it's so much broader than just a missing child case. It really touches on all sorts of modern uncertainty.
That's a crucial point to understand right from the start. Ambiguous grief comes up anytime there's a lack of definitive knowledge about the presence or absence of a loved one.
So it's not just about a body being missing.
No, not at all. It can also be about a psychological presence being lost, even when the physical presence is still there.
Can you give us an example of that? Losing someone psychologically while they're still physically here?
Certainly. That's what's often called type 2 ambiguous loss. You see it very frequently in cases of severe dementia, Alzheimer's, or a chronic traumatic brain injury. The person you knew, their personality, their memories, their ability to recognize you, all of that is gone. But their body is still physically present. The person is, in Dr. Boss's words, there but not there.
That puts the classic missing person case into really sharp contrast then. That's where the person is physically absent, but could be, psychologically present somewhere out there.
Precisely. That's type 1. It's what happens when, say, a partner abandons a family with no explanation, or when refugees are separated from loved ones during a war.
Or even long military deployments.
Yes, when a person's whereabouts are unknown for long periods, the family is forced to live in this state of indefinite waiting.
The core difficulty, and the sources really stress this, is that the family is just left in this constant state of emotional limbo. They have to carry two completely opposing realities at the same time. It must be mentally and emotionally just debilitating.
It's exhausting. It really is. Because the situation demands two totally different kinds of action. On one hand, you have this sliver of desperate, life-sustaining hope that the person is alive.
Right, that they'll come back.
So you have to keep their room ready, keep their clothes, keep checking your phone every 5 minutes. But on the other hand, there's this paralyzing fear that the worst has happened. And you should be mourning. You should be trying to move towards some kind of acceptance.
And that mental tug of war, it just prevents you from doing either one.
Exactly. You're stuck.
So the family is basically trapped in a psychological no man's land, completely unable to perform the necessary tasks of mourning or searching or just adapting. And the research, it breaks down the emotional toll into 4 key challenges that these families face.
And when you see them laid out, you really understand why this specific kind of chronic pain needs its own recognition.
So the first one is the most obvious, right?
It is the fundamental lack of closure. Without any confirmation of life or death, the grieving process just kercat. It can't start or finish its natural course. It's like trying to finish a jigsaw puzzle when you know for a fact that the final, most important piece is missing. That stress of being incomplete, it just never goes away.
And then there's the second challenge, the sheer agony of ongoing trauma. This is just brutal. It's not a single event. It becomes a chronic condition.
Oh, absolutely. Every new lead, every potential sighting, every little mention on social media or in the news, it instantly reopens these deep, deep wounds and forces the family to completely reset their emotional state.
It's a debilitating cycle of hope, which is then almost inevitably followed by despair.
It is. If the lead turns out to be false, the family has to re-grieve the loss of that hope, only to have to be ready to jump right back into that cycle the next time a flash of possibility appears. It makes any kind of emotional consistency totally impossible.
And the third challenge, which sounds incredibly isolating, is social disenfranchisement. Society seems pretty good at handling finite grief, you know? We have funerals, we send cards, we offer support for that first year.
But we struggle profoundly with indefinite pain.
So that's the mechanism of disenfranchisement.
Yes. Society fails to recognize or validate ambiguous grief because, well, frankly, it makes people uncomfortable. We're a culture that demands tidy answers.
We want a conclusion.
We do.
Yeah.
And when there isn't one, people often give useless, sometimes really damaging advice. They'll tell families to move on or to get over it or stop worrying since you don't know for sure.
Oh, that's awful.
It is. And this lack of validation makes their unique chronic pain so deeply isolating. You see friends, sometimes even immediate family, they retreat because they don't know how to sustain that kind of indefinite support.
So it sounds like the outside world is essentially forcing the family to carry all of that uncertainty completely alone, which just makes the trauma worse.
Precisely. And that's compounded by the fourth challenge, complicated decision-making. This is where it moves from the purely emotional into the administrative, the legal, the practical world, which is just as exhausting.
We're talking about those agonizing choices that have huge psychological weight, aren't they?
Exactly. Decisions like, do we sell the house? Do we clean out their apartment? Should we keep paying their phone bill?
Each one is a small practical step, but it feels like a permanent move toward accepting they're gone.
Yes, which directly conflicts with that persistent hope they're trying to hold on to. And then you have the really big one, having the missing person legally declared deceased. It's a step you need for things like insurance or accessing funds, but emotionally, for many, it feels like the ultimate betrayal.
In Dr. Boss's work, it highlights that all of these dilemmas, the emotional and the practical, they take a profound toll. She cites chronic stress, anxiety, clinical depression, post-traumatic symptoms. It really is a chronic illness of the mind, and it's rooted in the absence of information.
And that is exactly why just naming the pain is so revolutionary for these families. Well, when you're going through this set of contradictory emotions, feeling like you're going crazy for keeping hope alive, while you're also, say, researching funeral plots, and then you hear that these feelings are normal for something called ambiguous grief, it provides this immense sense of relief.
So just acknowledging the validity of the experience helps families feel seen and heard and supported.
It validates the reality of their pain. It removes some of that self-doubt that comes from feeling like you're grieving the wrong way.
Which leads to this crucial nuance in the sources that healing is still possible, even if definitive closure and answer never actually arrives.
Yes, the goal isn't certainty. The goal is adaptation.
So the key isn't necessarily getting an answer, it's learning how to manage the unanswered question. Shifting from why did they leave to how do we live with not knowing?
Absolutely. The focus shifts to meaning-making, to coping with loss as a process instead of a single event, and rebuilding your identity around that absence. And that's why specialized resources, counselors, support groups are so essential. They teach coping strategies that recognize the nonlinear, chronic nature of this kind of mourning.
Okay, so we've established the private, profound emotional cost of ambiguous grief. But that emotional cost is then compounded by these structural systems that, well, they just seem broken. When you look at the official state response, the systems built to bring certainty are struggling with the very fundamentals.
Starting with how to even define the loss in the first place.
Exactly.
This is where the technical research really hits home. The first major issue is the complete lack of a universal operational definition. The research highlights something called Recommendation 20, the urgent need to adopt internationally agreed-upon definitions of missing persons and children.
And without that universal definition, you just get these wildly different national practices, which creates this semantic snag that immediately compromises any kind of cross-border data reliability. It sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare with very real-world consequences.
It absolutely is. And the sheer volume of runaways children who deliberately leave their home or a care facility, that volume often overwhelms the systems that were designed to find children who are abducted or in immediate life-threatening danger.
And that pressure forces countries to start redefining who even counts as missing, just so they can better allocate their resources.
Exactly.
Let's use Poland as a prime example here, because a simple administrative change radically altered their perception of the problem.
It's a perfect case study. Post-2018, Poland enacted a reform, Ordinance Number 48. And under this new legal definition, runaways were no longer considered a missing child case.
Wait, so they don't fall under the criminal investigation units anymore?
Correct. Instead, those cases were moved over to be handled by prevention police departments.
Doesn't that mean that the most vulnerable population, the kids who run away over and over again because of serious underlying problems at home or in care, they're basically just optimized out of existence in the high-priority data sets?
That is the core conflict. That's exactly it. This change instantly and significantly decreased the officially reported number of missing children in Poland. On paper, it looks like a success in managing the crime rate.
But it's just a data adjustment. It's not a solution.
Not at all. It separates the child from the urgency of a criminal investigation. Now, that might improve resource allocation for true abductions, but it diminishes the visibility of this high-frequency population that desperately needs intervention and support.
And that's a huge contrast with the approach in, say, the Netherlands, where they keep runaways in the system, but they use a spectrum of urgency to prioritize.
Correct. The Dutch police use a definition of urgent disappearance, which is where there's substantial danger, clear clues, or behavior that completely deviates from the norm, and they contrast that with other disappearances.
So every case gets followed up on.
Every case requires follow-up. But this categorization acts as a crucial volume control for the police. It immediately sets the intensity and the resource scale of the investigation. It's a functional way to differentiate risk without just erasing a whole population from the data.
We also see this kind of complexity in how countries structure their response based on risk factors, like in Belgium, where they define a worrying disappearance.
Belgium bases that worrying designation not just on the act of disappearing, but on known vulnerabilities.
Like age.
Exactly. Being under 13, having a mental or physical disability, needing medication, or showing behavior that is totally out of character. These factors are critical because they inform the prosecuting magistrate's decision. And that decision dictates whether the Specialized Missing Persons Unit even gets involved.
So if the disappearance isn't classified as worrying, that whole specialized unit doesn't even get activated.
Correct.
And finally, you have the structural fragmentation we see in Greece, where the issue isn't just about the definition, but about collaboration.
Or lack thereof. Greece, historically, hasn't had a specific legal framework just for missing children. They relied on this general concept of invisibility.
Which forces the key stakeholders to operate separately.
Yes, the Hellenic police and the major NGO Smile of the Child, they end up using separate definitions, separate statistical methods. And this leads to persistent, often significant differences in the numbers they report and how they collect their data.
And even though the police mandated in 2023 that every missing person under 18 is now defined as vulnerable,
the data silos between the state and that crucial NGO, they still persist.
It's clear that no matter how a country decides to count them, runaways are the vast majority of missing minors across Europe. The data from places like Italy and Romania really bears that out.
And those children are not running away for no reason. Their reasons come from deeply complex problems in their environment, problems at home, issues at school, or critically, friction within institutional care.
The sources show over and over that kids running from institutional care homes are disproportionately represented in the data, especially in places like Lithuania and Finland.
which highlights a system failure within the institutional care itself.
Yeah.
And it seems like how the system handles the return of a runaway child is critical in determining whether they run again.
Absolutely. The research notes that the way a runaway child is welcomed back or punished plays a huge role in whether it happens again. If the system just treats it as undesirable behavior that needs to be punished.
Then the real underlying problems like neglect or abuse or unmet mental health needs, they aren't solved. They're just suppressed until the child leaves again.
It seems like Lithuania is trying to get ahead of this.
They are. They're implementing something called an algorithm for response to harmonize mandatory actions for all stakeholders when a child goes missing, and just as importantly, when they return. The focus is shifting to root causes.
Now, if runaways are a major problem, unaccompanied migrant children, or UMCs, represent a category with extreme intersectional vulnerabilities. This was noted particularly in Cyprus and Italy.
UMCs are children who are separated from both parents and are not being cared for by a legally responsible adult. And this is where the data just becomes severely compromised.
Why is that?
Because of persistent data barriers and massive underreporting, often these children fear state authorities, so that it's just impossible to know the actual number of UMCs going missing.
To put that data gap into perspective, there was an investigation called Lost in Europe. It found that at least 18,000 unaccompanied migrant children disappeared after arriving in Europe between 2018 and 2020.
And that 18,000 figure is chillingly considered a major underestimation. It's a population that simply vanishes from the system.
And understanding how they vanish is key. What are the drivers for these disappearances?
Well, the drivers are this tragic mix of structural failures and deliberate exploitation. First, you have poor reception conditions when they arrive. Substandard housing, no cultural support.
Then a desperate lack of child-friendly information. They don't know their rights or what legal pathways are available.
Exactly. Third, inefficient family reunification procedures, which leads children to try and reach relatives illegally on their own.
And fourth, and this seems to be the most critical, fear.
Fear is huge. Fear of detention, fear of deportation, and the fact that they often don't fully understand their legal rights, including the right to have a dedicated guardian. This uncertainty makes them uniquely vulnerable to criminal networks.
The Netherlands case study mentioned a very distinct, horrifying trend.
It did. Nigerian girls and Indian and Vietnamese boys going missing in specific patterns.
And that pattern led to?
It led directly to the exposure and dismantling of large human trafficking networks. For the Nigerian girls, we saw cases linked to sexual exploitation and even illegal adoption schemes. For the boys, it was often forced labor or illegal mobility to join family in another country.
Which means they're being moved by criminal facilitators who are exploiting them along the way.
Yes. They're either forced to run away by the very conditions they find themselves in, or they're trafficked almost immediately upon arrival.
The scope of this UMC data problem is just enormous. They're lost not only because of poor policing, but because they're caught between asylum systems, child welfare systems, and organized crime.
Which is why systems like Eurodac, the EU database of fingerprints for asylum seekers, are so critical, but also so fraught with complications when you apply them to children.
It's a tool for identification.
It is, but the data in it is strictly limited, and it often doesn't connect with the local police data on social vulnerabilities or disappearance history. It's essentially a fingerprint silo.
This brings us right to the operational architecture that's supposed to be finding these children. Across the EU, we see this critical problem of fragmentation. In countries like Belgium, Italy, Greece, you have this multiplicity of stakeholders.
Police, hotlines like 116,000 NGOs, guardianship services.
And the key issue isn't just the number of actors, but that they all use different non-interoperable data systems.
It's like every police force has its own filing cabinet, and when a child crosses a border, we're asking the system to fax a handwritten note instead of using a shared cloud database.
So police databases are separate from NGO databases.
Completely. In France, for example, their main police files, the FPR, TJ, and FNAEG, have no automated way of talking to each other, which just drastically frustrates operational efficiency when time is absolutely critical.
And if interoperability is one challenge, the law itself is the biggest external one. Let's talk about the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. Our sources cite it over and over as a hurdle since it came into effect in 2018.
Right. And data protection and privacy laws are vital for protecting civil liberties, let's be clear. But they frequently complicate what data can be collected and more importantly, what can be shared, especially across borders and between different agencies, like police versus social services.
What's the specific friction point there? Is it about the urgency of an investigation clashing with the right to be forgotten after the child is found?
Precisely. That's the core legal conflict. Operational urgency versus long-term prevention. Police are justified in collecting data for immediate detection, physical description, location, things like that. However, GDPR mandates that data shouldn't be retained longer than necessary for the purpose it was collected.
So once a child is found, the purpose of detection is over.
Exactly. And then police struggle to justify legally holding on to the specific contextual data, mental health indicators, family friction, sexual orientation, because that data wasn't strictly necessary for the immediate trace, but is absolutely vital for future prevention and for recognizing patterns.
So the law, in trying to protect privacy, inadvertently creates this fundamental disconnect between the data needed for detection and the data needed for long-term prevention.
It creates a data gap. Police systems prioritize the systematic collection of data for the immediate search: name, age, physical features, last known location. This is essential for finding the child now.
But they don't systematically collect the contextual information needed for effective long-term prevention.
And if that contextual data is collected, where does it go?
Good question.
It's often just relegated to unstructured notes or body of text or some narrative summary, as we saw in the Netherlands and Greece. It's left to the discretion of the reporting officer.
So crucial information on mental health, family background, vulnerabilities, it isn't flagged as a searchable, quantifiable field in the police database.
Which means if a child is a repeat runaway because of specific, documented but non-criminal abuse, the police file might have that crucial context, but it's hidden in a narrative note that's effectively impossible to cross-reference with hundreds of other files. It makes pattern recognition impossible.
That's a failure of intelligence.
It is. The governmental stakeholders, like in the Cyprus case study, they're primarily concerned with efficiently tracing the child a task where context isn't always seen as paramount. They often view robust data processing for future pattern recognition as a trivial matter compared to immediate action.
This prioritization ensures they find the child quickly, but they systematically lose the actionable intelligence they need to prevent the next disappearance.
Or to protect another vulnerable child.
It sounds like Lithuania, though, is trying to fight this administrative blindness by focusing on recurrence.
They are. Lithuania is one of the member states that's systematically requiring the collection of recurrence data. So they're tracking repeated cases where the same child goes missing 2 or 3 times, 4 or 5 times, and so on.
Which acknowledges that the high-frequency runaways demand a different kind of intervention than a single, isolated disappearance.
Exactly. They're moving the focus from where's the child to why does this child keep leaving?
Despite all these data clashes and the fragmentation, there is a large existing international infrastructure that's designed to overcome these national barriers. Let's look at the tools that are actually working on a European scale. The most important one for immediate cross-border action has to be the Schengen Information System 2, or SIS.
SAC is the IT backbone for public security across the Schengen states. It stores alerts on people and objects. And for missing children, its utility was significantly boosted in 2018.
How so?
It now allows national authorities to issue preventive alerts for children who are deemed at risk of abduction, trafficking, or even radicalization. This ensures that when a child crosses a border, that information is immediately accessible to the border guards and police of the receiving country. It's the closest thing we have to a unified real-time alert system.
And complementing that tech network, we have a critical human network, the 116,000 hotline.
This is the European Universal Number, and it provides a free 24/7 service. It's coordinated by Missing Children Europe. The legal framework for it was also strengthened in 2018, ensuring that the national organizations running the hotline have guaranteed resources and access.
So they can provide that round-the-clock emotional and practical support to families in crisis.
Yes. It's a crucial first responder for those suffering from that ambiguous grief we started with.
Then there's the mechanism that often captures the public imagination, the Amber Alert system.
Amber Alert is a highly effective supportive tool, but it requires incredibly strict preconditions because of the massive public mobilization it kicks off.
It has to involve a minor.
A minor, guardian consent, prosecutor agreement, a suspicion of a criminal act, and tangible evidence of imminent danger. It can't be used for routine runaways.
But when it is used,
When it is used under those controlled conditions, places like Poland and Romania noted that it has a very high effectiveness in getting the public to look for specific vehicles or individuals.
and finally, we have to differentiate between these disappearances and parental abductions, which follow an entirely separate legal track.
And this separation adds another layer of complexity to the whole data landscape. Parental abductions, where one parent takes a child without the other parent's consent, often across international borders, are handled through a distinct civil law channel, the Hague Convention of 1980.
So why is the Hague Convention separate from standard police procedures, and how does that hinder overall data collection?
It's separate because it's not seen as a criminal issue, but as a civil dispute about custody and residence. These cases are handled by what are called central authorities, like a country's Ministry of Justice, rather than standard police criminal procedures.
So the police might be asked to help find the child.
Right. But the data gathering, the legal process, the return mechanism, that's all governed by civil law protocols. So if a police database relies solely on criminal or high-risk definitions, these children, while definitely missing to one parent, might just fall through the cracks of the operational missing children data system.
So the systems are highly specialized, fragmented by urgency, by geography, by data regulation, and even by legal track. It's a miracle anything gets done at all.
It requires immense dedication and constant manual cross-referencing, which is precisely why the most vulnerable groups like the UMCs who fit into multiple categories are always the first to get lost.
So we've moved from the internal psychological cost to the structural chaos of these systems. Now we have to look at the external pressures that determine which cases even get prioritized, which families get support, and which are just left to suffer their ambiguous grief in silence.
And this is where we have to tackle missing white woman syndrome.
Right. MWWS. This term, it was coined by critics of the media landscape, and it describes that wall-to-wall, often sensationalized media coverage that's dedicated to missing white females.
Particularly those who are perceived as innocent or from middle-class backgrounds. It reflects a systemic unconscious bias in deciding which cases are newsworthy and deserving of urgent national attention.
And we have several empirical studies that confirm this isn't just anecdotal, it's mathematically verifiable. Let's start with the racial disparity.
The studies consistently found that missing white people, both men and women, received significantly more media coverage than missing black people. There was an influential 2016 study that cross-referenced news coverage against the FBI's missing persons database.
And what did it find?
It demonstrated that black missing persons received a disproportionately low share of news coverage when you compare it to their actual rate of missingness. And when a case involving a white girl or woman did appear in the news, the coverage was far more sustained, more intense, and more comprehensive than for cases involving other demographics.
And gender is also a huge factor in driving visibility, isn't it? Regardless of race.
Oh, absolutely. The research confirms female victims get more coverage overall, and any attention at the national or out-of-state level is heavily skewed toward women. For example, one analysis in Louisiana found that missing women were 12 times more likely than missing men to get media attention.
Even though the national missing rates for men and women are pretty similar.
Exactly. It seems society finds the victimization of women and girls inherently more tragic or compelling, which drive higher consumption of those stories.
Now, this is a really fascinating nuance from a 2019 study, which refines the common understanding of MWWS. It suggests the term itself is a bit imprecise in its focus.
Yes. That 2019 study showed that non-black women of color, specifically Asian and Latino women, were found to be just as overrepresented as white women in news coverage.
Okay, so if non-black women of color are also highly covered, what does that tell us about how the bias works?
It suggests the syndrome is less about the exclusive overrepresentation of white women and more a function of the severe structural underrepresentation of black women and girls in media coverage of missing persons cases.
So it's more of an anti-black bias in media selection, compounded by that general gender bias toward covering female victims.
That appears to be the mechanism.
And this visibility factor has real-world consequences, connecting right back to Section 2. When a case gets that wall-to-wall coverage, the pressure on law enforcement is exponentially higher.
Which leads to greater resource allocation, public tip lines, national task forces. For the families, that intense coverage shortens their time in ambiguous grief by increasing the chances of a resolution, good or bad.
And on the flip side, when a case gets no coverage, the family suffers alone, often for decades, just deepening that chronic state of ambiguous grief.
The background and framing of the victim are also critical in determining visibility. The sources highlight that coverage often focuses heavily on girls from respectable middle-class families. The victims have to fit a certain narrative of innocence.
The UK examples here are really powerful. I'm thinking of the intense media focus and public outcry over the murders of Sarah Payne and Millie Dowler.
Both of whom were white, middle-class girls. The media presented them as tragic, innocent victims, demanding national outrage and even legislative change.
And you can contrast that starkly with the initial coverage for Damilola Taylor, a 10-year-old boy from Nigeria who was killed.
The initial reports on Taylor, they didn't concentrate on him as an innocent victim. They focused on generalized street crime levels and community policing failures. The story became about social problems, not about a single tragic loss.
So even when his father flew into the UK to make press appearances?
The level of public outcry, the sources assert, it just didn't reach the near hysterical outpourings that accompanied the deaths of the white girls.
It sounds like if you are an established, middle-class, white victim, your disappearance is framed as a personal tragedy demanding justice. But if you're a less privileged victim, your disappearance is framed as a symptom of a larger systemic problem that requires long-term policy solutions.
And one mobilizes immediate resources, the other does not. That is the essential structural difference in the framing.
And this isn't just a UK or US phenomenon.
No, it's global. The South Africa example is highly illustrative. The discrepancy in media coverage between the white model Riva Steenkamp and the black model Zanele Khumalo. Both were murdered by their boyfriends under similar circumstances.
But the Khumalo family's pain was effectively ignored by the mainstream media in favor of the Steenkamp case, which became an international sensation.
It demonstrates how structural bias impacts whose pain is acknowledged and whose story is erased. And the research points out that these coverage narratives can actively influence public perception by framing the victim not just as tragic, but as potentially culpable.
How does that happen?
Well, reports are often framed as cautionary tales, and sometimes the victims are even framed as active participants in their disappearance. This narrative is especially common for runaways who come from less respectable backgrounds, like those from institutional care, or UMCs who are victims of trafficking. The framing shifts the responsibility onto the victim or their environment.
Which further complicates public sympathy and reduces the political will to allocate resources to solve those cases.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean when we bring these three complex areas, the personal, the structural, and the social, all together? We've mapped a really deep and tragic contradiction here.
The painful conclusion is that the psychological chaos of ambiguous grief is almost perfectly mirrored by the structural chaos of our international systems.
On one hand, you have families suffering this chronic, unseen emotional damage.
And on the other, you have authorities who are intensely focused on defining cases for their immediate operational urgency, like Poland moving runaways to prevention departments, or the Netherlands classifying cases as urgent versus other.
And crucially, that external societal bias missing white woman syndrome determines which victims get priority access to those operational systems, which ultimately determines who has the highest chance of escaping that emotional limbo.
And by prioritizing that immediate detection data name, location, time, and administratively sidelining all that crucial contextual vulnerability data into unstructured notes, these systems are neglecting the intelligence they need to understand the underlying drivers.
They're highly efficient at finding the child this time, but they fail at improving long-term prevention strategies to make sure the child doesn't disappear again.
The good news, though, is that there's a massive existing international infrastructure to build on. We have SI-SEX for alerts, Eurodac for migrant fingerprints, the 116,000 hotlines.
So the path forward isn't necessarily about inventing new systems, but about aligning and managing the existing ones better, mandating the collection of prevention data.
And there is a specific high vulnerability group that requires immediate, unified action and data management. Unaccompanied migrant children, the UMCs. The research suggests the European Guardianship Network, or EGN, has a pivotal role to play here.
Why the EGN specifically? I mean, they aren't a police agency.
No, but every member state is supposed to have a functional system for assigning guardians to these children. If the EGN can unify international data on UMCs, if they can establish protocols for who should be contacted in what country and what specific contextual information needs to be shared across borders despite GDPR.
They could justify it under the child's best interest?
Exactly. If they can do that, they could drastically reduce the number of these vulnerable children who are lost to trafficking and exploitation. They could provide the coherence that the fragmented police systems currently lack.
And that structural effort could ultimately bring a measure of stability and certainty to some of the most complex, tragic cases of ambiguous loss. It moves the effort from just reactive searching to proactive preventative protection.
Indeed, it's about designing systems that manage the whole child, not just the physical location of the child.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. Something to mull on as you continue your own deep dive into this material. If a lack of confirmed information is what creates ambiguous grief in a family, and GDPR rules complicate the sharing of detailed data between countries, what specific contextual data, the kind that's currently relegated to those unstructured notes in local police files, things like specific mental health diagnoses or history of institutional placement or family environment tensions, what data do you believe is most essential for finding and protecting children before they disappear again?